Well, hello, and welcome to this podcast episode. Before we go into it, just a reminder, if you've been listening to this podcast for a few episodes, please consider leaving a rating wherever you're listening on. It doesn't matter if it's Google or if it's Stitcher or if it's Apple. Leave a rating, and better yet, leave a review. Don't just be a silent bystander. It's important for people to know what people think of this podcast. That helps, especially for people to find this podcast. So please, if you are listening to this, I would really love it if you would leave a rating or a review. It really means a lot to me, and I would love to have people respond. So thanks. This episode is a little bit different. It is one of the commentary episodes, but I have to kind of explain a little bit about myself and a little bit about a change that's going to happen. First thing is about me. Some of you may know this, some of you may not know this, in that I was diagnosed about 12 years ago, 13 years ago now, with what used to be called Asperger's syndrome. So that means that I am on the autistic spectrum, and I also have ADHD. So why is that important? The reason that's important is because it kind of explains sometimes how I act in life. I remember when I had got my Asperger's diagnosis, someone once commented that when they kind of noticed what I did, it was that I just kind of do things. That sometimes I kind of fall into or rush into something without really thinking about it. It's just I'm doing it. And I think that that is a kind of a classic thing for people who are on the spectrum, is that they don't put a whole lot of time and thought. It's not that we're not smart, but I think if something makes sense, you just go ahead and do it. And that was kind of the thing that happened with this podcast. It's something I had actually been thinking about doing a podcast, and I just kind of threw myself into it. And so when I threw myself into it, I kind of knew what I wanted to do, but I didn't know how to say it and how to put it into words. And that kind of happens to me a lot, that I can rush into something without really thinking through what is it that I'm trying to say, what is it that I'm trying to do here. And the thing is that doesn't always come to me immediately. Sometimes it takes a while. And I think the way that I have always learned things in life, whether it's in ministry, whether it's with my skills in graphic design, is really by trial and error. Again, I tend to do things, and sometimes people overthink things or think things so much that they don't end up doing anything. And sometimes I do things but don't really think them through. And that really leads to the podcast. Podcast, I think it's sound what I'm wanting to do. But like I said, it's taken me a while to kind of figure out how to describe this podcast. I knew that it was going to be about religion. I knew it was going to be about politics. Those are things that I've always been fascinated in. I knew that there were times I wanted to do things on culture and things that didn't always fit. There were things that I wanted to do, to talk about, but I didn't know how best to describe it. And I think when I came out with the first name for this podcast, I thought that made sense. But after a while, and kind of kind of letting it sink in, it didn't feel right. I don't know, it just kind of felt a little fake, I guess is the best way. It didn't, I couldn't really, in fact, I was having a hard time describing what it truly is, and I couldn't do that. So I did some more thinking and thought about another name. And that name, Spheres of Influence, had some good things about it, things that I like. It reflects some of my belief, especially when it comes to theology. I've always been fascinated by the writings of Abraham Kuyper, who is a Dutch theologian, and he came up with the belief in sphere sovereignty. But that's something that's probably a little, I won't say it's a little too deep, but it's maybe too obscure. And again, when I tried to figure out how to really describe it, I couldn't. I just couldn't easily describe what this podcast was about. I knew again that it was about things that were important. In this case, the different spheres in our lives, again about religion, again about politics, and again about culture. But I couldn't tell you exactly what it is. And every time I said the name, it didn't feel right. It didn't feel like it was mine. So I've been doing more thinking. And part of me didn't want to do any more thinking because I've already changed the name of this once. It sounds a little unprofessional to try to go through this a second time. But I felt like it wasn't me. And I don't want to do a podcast that is presenting someone for a false version of me. I wanted something that is authentic to me and who I am, and to introduce that to you, because it's in a way of introducing myself to you. So I've been doing more thinking, and even thought about the fact of what I'm doing, of thinking about changing the name of this podcast again. And what I've come to the conclusion about my own life, and why I told you about my diagnoses, is that in some ways my life has always been one that is unfinished, that is always in process. It's not complete. And I think for a long time I always kind of was nervous that I wasn't perfect or wasn't put together well. That I'm always kind of incomplete, kind of feel like sometimes a house that's partway finished, being remodeled, but not totally yet. But that is how in many ways my life has always been. Life has always been in some ways incomplete. And so that I'm always working on finishing. And I don't know if I'm any closer to being finished or not, but everything is still always happening. And I've likened it more and more kind of like a trip. And the trip is really the trip itself, not necessarily getting from point A to point B, as fun as that is, but the trip itself. And, I've done a lot of travels over the years, travels to visit relatives in Louisiana, travels to visit relatives in Puerto Rico, travels to other parts of the world. And I truly believe over and over again that the thing that is the most exciting part of this is not necessarily the destination. It's actually the journey, the traveling itself. And I can think about a few years ago when my husband and I were going to Germany. It was my first time going to Germany. Not my first time in Europe, but I hadn't been to Germany. And so we were on our flight from Minneapolis to Reykjavik, Iceland, and just excited. There's always something exciting about making this travel and this plane. There's always excitement to look at the monitor and see where your plane is and what's the journey like and what's the time like and the other where you're arriving. Traveling itself is something that is fun. Even traveling when I did 20 years ago when I traveled to Hong Kong and China itself, it was, from LA to Hong Kong, it was 15 hours. It was 15 hours on a 747, and it was still exciting. I still loved it. For some people, being sitting on a plane for that long is pretty much their version of hell. And for me, it was exciting because I was on this trip, this journey, and for me especially, it was kind of this wild journey because I'm crossing the international date line, and I'm changing dates. I'm leaving like on a early Friday morning and getting in Saturday morning. It's just kind of crazy. And the thing that I love about that is that the whole concept that things are moving, things are changing. They're not the same. And it's a little weird for someone, especially someone with autism, to like change. But in some ways, change has always been part of my life, even as much as that it can bring a lot of anxiety. And the thing is that I think that change is something that we all deal with. It's been interesting talking to people, especially people, being that I am a Trump critic, never Trumper, Republican. It's been interesting to find people who talk to me and tell me, well, I've never changed. Everyone else has changed. I haven't changed. And I want to be respectful because some of these are people that I care about, but it's kind of like, I kind of think that that's kind of bullshit. Of course people change. Of course you change. Yes, other people change too, but so have you. To pretend that you've never changed is kind of lying to yourself. The fact is, every one of us are always changing. And so and that's just something that's fascinating to me. So, as I said, I've always loved travel. I, as a kid, would love to read the Rand McNally map. And I would actually, I remember years ago, I would buy one. This was like a 1983 Rand McNally map, and I got it. And I think for years, I just kept looking at that map. Even when I wasn't going on a trip, I would get it out and look at the freeways and where they went and all that. This also is my weird love for the interstate highway system. Yes, this also further shows how much of a geek I am. It's just, I've always loved the thing of transit, of moving, and I think that, and like I said, that always mirrors my own life. Things are always changing. Things are always in tension. There are things about me that I think don't always make sense, at least in the way that our culture looks at things. And so when I thought about that, the thing that came to mind, well, first it was in process, but that felt really hard, like people wouldn't understand what that is. And then I came up with one that I thought made some sense. Well, before I do that, there was another one that I thought about, letters of transit. But again, that one was going to be a little bit harder to understand. It's a little esoteric of where that comes from, which I believe it comes from Casablanca. Kind of a Blurs of Transit is kind of like a passport in a way. It is also, I believe, an episode of the TV series Fringe. But again, I thought that was way too esoteric. So the word, a phrase that kept coming to mind, the one that I really liked was en route. Because I think about that a lot when you're traveling, you're en route to a place. You're en route to some destination. But the point about being en route isn't that you are at the destination, but that you are heading towards it. It's part of a journey. And so when that word came to mind, I kind of let it sit for a few days to see what it meant. And I liked it. It was more simple. It wasn't as esoteric as some of my past names. And I think it's also because it describes me. And when I sat down to try to describe what I thought this podcast was about, the words came a lot easier. And the words felt genuine. Whereas when I tried that for the last two names, they didn't feel as genuine. And if anything, I want this podcast to be something that is from my viewpoint, my standpoint. Obviously, to hear other people's views. But since this is my podcast, I want people to know where I'm coming from. So, in doing, kind of sitting with that phrase of en route, that's what I came up with. And that's what is going to be the new name, and I think, and it will be the final name for this podcast. Like I said, life for me has always been in process. It's always changing. And that's kind of where I was at when I came up with why these other words just didn't work. I had to kind of try it over and over again until I got to a point where it felt right. And this does feel right. So, the point now for en route will not be the things that you can't talk about in public. And in some ways we talk about these things more in public than we do. It's not necessarily about the important spheres in our lives, but it is about the things that we meet along the way, the encounters, the thoughts, maybe the change in growth, where one is headed. I think that those are the things that will be the focus. It's still going to be on religion, politics, and culture. But I think it's more about the destination. It's about where we're headed. I wanted to kind of read a little bit of what I came up with. Like I said, I've talked a little bit about this, and the topics that we are talking about now, religion and politics and culture, are all going through massive change. They're all going through their own journeys. And so what I want to do is talk about and talk to people who see that change, and how is it affecting them? How is it affecting all of us? I'm also going to continue to offer my own commentary about the changing nature of our world, my own change and change in belief and opinion, how these changes are both good and bad. I think one of the things that has always bothered me with some people over the years is when they pretend that they don't change. when they pretend that this has always been the way that they believe in things, and they don't really admit that they have changed. I think because change is a sign of weakness, and it's a sign of being wishy-washy. And so we want to pretend that we haven't changed our minds, that whatever opinion that we've had, we've always had. Or we try to play off our old belief, but more often than not, we try to bury it. And I don't want to do that. And I don't like when people do that. This whole podcast is going to be about dealing with change. And it'll deal with my own changes, which might frustrate people. If you are coming to this podcast to expect a certain viewpoint that will never ever change, I'm going to disappoint you. But if you're interested in how people evolve, how people grow, how societies change or don't change, then I hope that you will join me on this journey. And I want to thank you who are listening and who have listened to me through all these episodes, just to say thanks. Obviously, this has always been a work in progress. It is not done. And I hope that you will find this interesting. I hope that you have found this podcast interesting. I'm not the most flashy person, and I'm also probably not the most easiest person to get along with. But I hope that you will join me in trying to ask some questions and trying to continue to try to get things right, even if that means making a mistake over and over and over. So thank you. As I said, you will be on a watch out. The things, this podcast name will change permanently. And thank you again for being patient, for helping me to find my own voice, and not necessarily to be someone else's voice. So in the coming days and weeks, I am working on some episodes, interviews. I had one, actually, I thought I had one lined up yet for yesterday, and silly me, I said, here's the date that would work well, and the person gave me the time, and I never confirmed. I thought I had confirmed, but I hadn't. So we will be basically having that interview in 2 weeks, and it will be on the local news. I'm working on one also on retail, and hopefully I've been working on one on Afghanistan. The person I want to talk to has been very busy. They're a professor, so I have to kind of work with them to when they are free. So thank you for being patient, and we will get to hear from these people soon. Also, you'll hear some commentaries from me, but I do want to get into more interviews, and I hope to have a few more coming down the pike. And I hope that you enjoyed the one with Nap Nasworth. He was a fascinating interviewer, had a lot of good things to say, and I'm looking forward. I hope that we can chat again. Obviously, religion is something that has, as a pastor, has been very important to me. And especially what is going on within the Southern Baptist Convention is important, because it is in many ways a microcosm of what's going on in the larger evangelical culture, especially as it tries to figure out what its public voice is. So that's it for today. Again, if you have the opportunity, please leave a rating. It's important, and it's also good manners just to say hello. So I hope that you will do that. It is very helpful to me, and I will be incredibly appreciative as you do that. Also, feel free to, if you'd like to make a donation, you can do so. There is a link in the show notes that will go to help support this podcast, to help it to grow, to improve itself, and still kind of working on if there are like special things to do. Again, kind of donations and things like that are not my strong suit, but I hope that if you can, as they say, leave a little bit of money in the tip jar. That'll be helpful. That's it for now. I will be back again soon. Take care and Godspeed.